Number 5. Richard Chase, the Vampire of Sacramento. He believed his blood was turning to dust, that his heart had stopped, that he could only survive by drinking the blood of others. In 1970s California, Richard Trenton Chase brought his delusions to life with horrifying consequences. His crimes were not only grotesque, they were medically inspired nightmares, blurring the boundary between madness and monstrousness. Born in 1950, Chase grew up in a deeply dysfunctional household. His father was strict and often abusive, while his mother was emotionally distant. From an early age, Chase exhibited signs of severe mental illness. He was withdrawn, emotionally erratic, and obsessed with bodily functions, especially blood. During his adolescence, the signs escalated. He developed hypochondria so severe that he believed he was physically disintegrating. He thought his bones were moving under his skin. He insisted his heart would stop unless he ingested blood. He would press oranges to his forehead, claiming the vitamin C would absorb into his brain. No one intervened in time. By his early 20s, Chase's delusions spiraled into full-blown psychosis. He became obsessed with the belief that his blood was vanishing. In an effort to replenish it, he began killing animals, rabbits, cats, dogs, draining their blood and consuming their organs raw. At one point, he was hospitalized after injecting himself with rabbit blood, resulting in a severe case of blood poisoning. Doctors diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, but he was released after a brief institutional stay. He was deemed not a danger to others. That assessment would prove disastrously wrong. In 1977, Chase moved into a small apartment in Sacramento. Neighbors complained of the stench of death emanating from within. Inside, Chase had filled his refrigerator with raw animal parts and used the blender to puree them into a viscous red sludge. He drank this concoction daily, convinced it kept him alive. But soon, animal blood no longer sufficed. On December 29, 1977, Richard Chase committed his first known murder. His victim was 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin, a man entirely unknown to him. Chase approached Griffin randomly and shot him twice in a drive-by shooting. It was a test, an experiment to see if killing a human would satisfy the need he felt pulsing inside him. It did, for a time. Less than a month later, on January 23, 1978, Chase escalated. He broke into the home of Teresa Wallen, a 22-year-old pregnant woman. What followed was unspeakable. He shot her 3 times, dragged her body into the bedroom, and mutilated her corpse with a butcher knife. He removed several organs, engaged in necrophilic acts, and collected her blood in a yogurt container to drink. He defecated in her baby's crib before leaving. It was not only murder, it was ritualistic, frenzied desecration. 4 days later, Chase struck again. This time he entered the home of 36-year-old Evelyn Miroth. Inside were Evelyn, her 6-year-old son Jason, her 22-month-old nephew David, and her friend Dan Meredith. Chase murdered all 4. He shot Dan in the hallway. Then, using the same .22 caliber pistol, he killed Evelyn and the children. He mutilated Evelyn's body in ways similar to Wallen's. He bathed in her blood, cannibalized part of her liver, and sexually violated her corpse. When a knock at the door startled him, he fled, taking the infant's body with him. Police would later discover it decapitated and partially consumed. The media dubbed him the Vampire of Sacramento, and the name was grimly accurate. His crimes were marked not just by violence, but by an almost clinical obsession with blood. He wasn't killing for revenge, money, or even pleasure in a traditional sense. He was killing to survive, at least in his own deranged mind. Chase believed that a Nazi UFO conspiracy was attempting to poison him. He thought he had to kill in order to replenish his failing organs and keep his heart beating. Chase was apprehended shortly after the Miroth family murders. Police traced him through a series of chance encounters and forensic evidence, including fingerprints and bloodstains. When they searched his apartment, they found walls smeared with blood, dishes filled with body parts, and a calendar with the word "Today" marked on the dates of each murder. During his trial, the defense pleaded insanity. It wasn't a stretch. Chase clearly suffered from profound schizophrenia, and his crimes reflected a total disconnection from reality. But the jury rejected the plea. He was found guilty of 6 counts of murder and sentenced to death in the gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison. Yet the story doesn't end there. While on death row, Chase remained delusional. He spoke of Nazis, UFOs, and poisons. He claimed he was being harassed by invisible forces trying to steal his blood. Other inmates, terrified of him, refused to interact. He was considered so repulsive and insane that even hardened killers avoided him. On December 26, 1980, Richard Chase took his own life. He overdosed on a stockpile of antidepressants he had hoarded over time. Why does Chase rank so high on this list? Because his crimes represent the most chilling fusion of madness and mutilation. He did not kill for lust, greed, or sadism. He killed because his fractured mind believed he had no choice. His victims were chosen at random, attacked with impersonal brutality, and desecrated in grotesque ways. He consumed human flesh and drank blood, not as part of a sadistic fantasy, but as a delusional necessity. And perhaps most disturbingly, Chase might have continued indefinitely. He kept a calendar with future dates marked today, indicating that more killings were planned. Had police not stopped him, it's conceivable his spree could have rivaled the death tolls of far more methodical serial killers. Richard Chase is the living embodiment of what happens when untreated psychosis spirals into homicidal compulsion. A man so lost in delusion that he transformed his body into a vessel for horror and other people's blood into a lifeline. In the annals of American true crime, few killers evoke such visceral revulsion and such haunting pity. The Vampire of Sacramento was not only a killer, he was a broken mind unleashed. Number 4, Andrei Chikatilo, the Butcher of Rostov. He was a father, a teacher, a member of the Communist Party, and for over a decade he was the most prolific and elusive serial killer in Soviet history. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo, known as the Butcher of Rostov, brutally murdered at least 52 people between 1978 and 1990. His victims ranged in age from 7 to 45, but most were vulnerable children and young women. What makes Chikatilo uniquely terrifying is not just his body count, but the way his crimes flourished in the shadows of a rigid and secretive political regime, one that denied the very existence of serial murder. Born in 1936 in a small Ukrainian village during Stalin's brutal reign, Chikatilo's early life was shaped by starvation, shame, and trauma. His older brother, according to family lore, had been kidnapped and cannibalized during the Holodomor famine. Whether true or not, the story loomed large in Chikatilo's psyche. His childhood was defined by relentless hunger, poverty, and beatings from his alcoholic father and controlling mother. He was a shy, withdrawn child, often bullied and mocked for his awkward demeanor and chronic bedwetting. But it was puberty that marked the beginning of something far more sinister. Chikatilo discovered he was impotent, a fact that would become the core of his pathology. Sexual frustration, humiliation, and deep-seated rage combined to form a personality marked by repression and explosive violence. His first known sexual experience came when he tackled a young girl in his teens and ejaculated as she struggled beneath him. This link between violence and arousal would never be broken. Despite these early warning signs, Chikatilo appeared to lead a relatively normal life. He earned a degree in Russian literature, married, had 2 children, and held jobs as a teacher and supply clerk. But beneath the surface, he was unraveling. After being fired from a teaching job for molesting students, he found work in a traveling position, giving him access to isolated train stations, bus depots, and rural pathways. This is where the killings began. His first murder occurred in 1978. The victim was a 9-year-old girl named Yelena Zakotnova. Chikatilo lured her into an abandoned house, attempted intercourse, and, when he failed, stabbed her repeatedly. He found sexual gratification not through the act itself, but through the blood, the control, and the power. He later described the act as a kind of ecstasy. The body was dumped in a river. A mentally disabled man was arrested, coerced into confessing, and executed for the crime, allowing Chikatilo to continue unchecked. Over the next 12 years, the killings escalated. Chikatilo developed a precise hunting method. He targeted runaways, vagrants, and street children at train stations. He lured them with promises of food, money, or shelter. Once isolated, he would attack, usually stabbing his victims dozens of times, often targeting eyes, genitals, and abdomens. Some were mutilated while still alive. He frequently bit or chewed on body parts and in several cases removed internal organs. His crimes were ritualistic, compulsive, and deeply sadistic. Chikatilo later explained that the act of stabbing compensated for his sexual impotence. The act of dominating a helpless victim, inflicting pain and watching life drain from their bodies, was the only way he could experience release. What makes his spree especially haunting is how it intersected with the machinery of the Soviet state. At the time, Soviet authorities refused to acknowledge that serial killers existed within their borders. Serial murder, they claimed, was a Western phenomenon, impossible under socialism. This ideological blind spot hamstrung investigations. Evidence was buried, murders were misattributed. Innocent people were interrogated, imprisoned, even executed, while the real killer continued his rampage. It wasn't until the mid-1980s that a task force quietly began linking the murders together. In 1984, Chikatilo was arrested near a crime scene, but due to lack of evidence and a blood type mismatch, he was released. Soviet forensics at the time failed to consider that semen and blood types can differ due to rare enzyme variants. The error cost dozens more lives. Eventually, investigators turned to psychological profiling, a tactic then considered radical in the USSR. They consulted psychiatrist Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, who created a detailed profile describing the killer as a deeply disturbed, sexually impotent man, intelligent, middle-aged, and possibly employed in a technical or administrative field. The profile matched Chikatilo perfectly. Still, he evaded capture until November 1990. After years of surveillance and the discovery of fresh evidence, including eyewitness accounts and physical clues, Chikatilo was arrested while stalking a train station. During interrogation, he confessed to 56 murders in exhaustive detail. He was cold, methodical, and unrepentant. He described the killings as urges that built up inside him, uncontrollable and all-consuming. Each murder was a pressure release. He kept notes, maps, and victim counts. It was a system, a process. His trial in 1992 was a media spectacle. In court, Chikatilo appeared erratic, sometimes shouting, sometimes exposing himself, sometimes silent. He was held inside a steel cage for his own protection. The world saw not just a murderer, but a man utterly severed from moral and social reality. He was found guilty of 52 murders and sentenced to death. On February 14, 1994, Andrei Chikatilo was executed with a single gunshot behind the ear. So why is he ranked this high? Because Chikatilo's crimes weren't just numerous. They were symbolic of a system that failed to recognize evil in its midst. He was a predator nurtured by secrecy, denial, and bureaucratic incompetence. His violence was intimate, prolonged, and frenzied. He didn't just kill, he desecrated. His victims suffered in isolation, their cries unheard in a society that refused to admit such horrors could exist. He was the embodiment of suppressed rage, sexual dysfunction, and institutional blindness. And for 12 years, the Butcher of Rostov hunted with impunity, leaving a trail of ruined lives and unmarked graves. Number 3, Pedro Lopez, the monster of the Andes. He didn't just kill children, he hunted them, watched them, stalked them through crowded markets and remote villages. Pedro Alonso Lopez, known as the Monster of the Andes, is one of the most prolific murderers in recorded history, believed to be responsible for the deaths of over 300 girls across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. His crimes were so overwhelming in scale that authorities initially refused to believe them. Born in 1948 in Tolima, Colombia, Lopez's early life was a grim prelude to the horror he would eventually unleash. He was the 7th of 13 children, raised by a mother who worked in the red light trade. His father died before Lopez was born. From an early age, Lopez endured harsh physical punishment and exposure to a volatile home life. At age 8, after a troubling incident involving his sister, he was expelled from the household and forced to survive on the streets. There, Lopez was abducted by a group of older men and subjected to repeated abuse. This experience, deeply traumatic and formative, marked a turning point in his psychology. From that point on, his understanding of power, vulnerability, and violence became inseparably intertwined. Throughout adolescence, Lopez wandered through juvenile institutions and later fell into theft. He was eventually imprisoned for stealing a vehicle, where he claimed he was again assaulted by fellow inmates. He retaliated violently, allegedly killing one of them, and emerged from prison more embittered and alienated than before. When he was released in the late 1970s, Lopez began a killing spree that would span 3 nations. He targeted vulnerable communities, particularly impoverished towns and rural villages where missing persons often went unreported or under-investigated. His victims were typically young girls between the ages of 8 and 12. He would lure them from crowded public areas, markets, bus stations, schools, often by offering small gifts or assistance. Lopez took his victims to secluded areas, often wooded or rural terrain, where he committed his crimes. Forensic investigations later revealed evidence of strangulation and blunt force trauma, with consistent patterns across sites. According to his confessions, he would sometimes return to these locations and reflect quietly among the remains. The turning point came in 1980, after a flood unearthed several bodies in Ambato, Ecuador. Local panic grew as multiple child deaths were confirmed. When a girl narrowly escaped an attempted abduction and identified her attacker, Lopez was arrested. While in custody, he began to talk. During interrogation, Lopez confessed to killing over 300 girls, 110 in Ecuador alone. At first, authorities thought his claims were delusional, but then he led them to mass graves he had dug himself. At these sites, police found dozens of bodies, many still clad in school uniforms or children's clothing. His descriptions of each location were precise, his demeanor disturbingly calm. Despite the scale of his crimes, Ecuador's legal framework at the time limited even the most serious sentence to 16 years. In 1983, Lopez was convicted of the confirmed Ecuadorian murders and given that maximum term. He served only 14 years before being released in 1994 for so-called good behavior. After his release, Lopez was deported to Colombia, where he was detained and placed in a psychiatric facility. Doctors diagnosed him as a dangerous sociopath, but after a few years, he was declared mentally stable and released once again. By 1998, Pedro Lopez had disappeared. Interpol continues to list him as a wanted fugitive. He would now be in his 70s, but his whereabouts remain unknown. Some investigators believe he resumed his crimes under another identity. Others think he may have died in the Colombian underworld. No one can say for sure. Why does Pedro Lopez rank this high? Because his crimes reflect the extreme consequence of systemic failure, of apathy, mismanagement, and disbelief. His victims were not adults involved in high-risk lifestyles. They were children, marginalized, overlooked, and voiceless. The scale of his killing is almost incomprehensible. Entire communities were scarred. Families searched for answers that never came. Authorities in all three countries ignored or minimized reports of missing children. They failed to connect cases or share data across borders. And even after Lopez confessed and led them to the graves, legal systems still lacked the tools to administer proportional justice. He was released into the same society he terrorized. Psychologically, Lopez stands apart. He was not disorganized or impulsive. He was calculating, patient. He planned his movements, timed his attacks, and selected victims with chilling specificity. He kept a mental ledger of names, faces, and burial sites. He once said he would have continued killing if he hadn't been caught, and there's reason to believe he did. In interviews, Lopez displayed no remorse. He referred to his victims with disturbing detachment. In one quote, he compared them to lost innocence, as if projecting his own trauma onto them. To him, the violence was not aberrant. It was a form of release, a pattern he believed he was destined to repeat. Lopez is not just a prolific killer. He is a study in the consequences of indifference. His crimes went undetected for years, not because they were hidden well, but because no one was looking. He operated in the margins of geography, of class, of credibility, and in doing so, he exploited every weak link in society's protection of its most vulnerable. The monster of the Andes may still be alive, and that possibility, not just the past, but the future he might still affect, secures his place near the top of this list. Number 2, Albert Fish, the Gray Man. He wrote letters to the mothers of his victims, graphic, handwritten descriptions of what he had done to their children, not to apologize, but to relive the act. Albert Fish, known as the Gray Man, is often cited as one of the most disturbing killers in American history. His crimes were not driven purely by compulsion or opportunity. They were ideological, ritualistic. He believed suffering was beautiful, and he made others endure it for his pleasure. Born in 1870, Hamilton Howard Albert Fish was raised in a family marred by severe mental illness. His father died when he was 5, and his mother, unable to care for him, placed him in an orphanage. There, Fish was regularly beaten, but unlike most children, he came to enjoy the pain. In his own words, he learned to associate pleasure with punishment. This early fusion of trauma and arousal would define the rest of his life. As a young man, Fish led a seemingly normal existence. He worked as a house painter, married, and fathered 6 children. But beneath the surface, he was spiraling. He began engaging in behaviors that escalated over time, writing obscene letters, inserting needles into his own body, self-flagellation, and developing a fixation on biblical passages about sacrifice and suffering. He became obsessed with the idea that inflicting pain, especially on children, was spiritually redemptive. Fish was a sadomasochist and a cannibal. He targeted vulnerable children, particularly those of single mothers or immigrant families. He would pose as a kindly old man offering them candy or odd jobs. Once lured into a secluded location, he subjected them to horrific acts of violence, often invoking religious delusions to justify his behavior. He later claimed that God had commanded him to torture and consume innocents as penance for the sins of mankind. His most infamous crime was the murder of 10-year-old Grace Budd in 1928. Fish had initially approached the Budd family under the pretense of offering work to Grace's older brother. Instead, he gained their trust and convinced them to let Grace accompany him to a fictitious children's party. She never returned. 6 years later, Grace's mother received a letter in the mail. It was from Fish. In it, he detailed what he had done to her daughter in nauseating prose. The letter was not only a confession, it was a trophy, a final act of dominance over the family. This letter ultimately led to his arrest in 1934. When police confronted him, Fish calmly admitted to not only Grace's murder, but several others. He claimed to have harmed over 100 children, though exact numbers remain unverified. Authorities found dozens of needles embedded in his pelvis during x-rays, placed there over years of self-inflicted torture. His apartment was sparse, dirty, and filled with religious texts, ropes, and instruments of restraint. During his trial, Fish's defense argued insanity, and by all modern assessments, Fish was indeed mentally unwell. He was diagnosed with multiple psychosexual disorders, including sadism, masochism, and delusional religiosity. But the court deemed him legally sane, capable of distinguishing right from wrong. He was convicted of Grace Budd's murder and sentenced to death. On January 16, 1936, Albert Fish was executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. Witnesses said he went to his death without fear. In fact, he welcomed it. He believed the electric chair would be the ultimate form of self-inflicted pain, and he looked forward to it. So why is Albert Fish number 2? Because he is the embodiment of personalized evil. Not just a killer, but a man who ritualized pain, wrote it into doctrine, and evangelized it to others. His violence was not reactive. It was premeditated, philosophical, and deeply personal. He inflicted suffering because he believed it was sacred. He killed children not as a means to an end, but as an expression of his identity. Fish's legacy is more than his crimes. It is the terror he instilled in an entire generation. The grotesque overlap between psychosis and theology, and the slow, methodical way he captured his victims. He blurred the lines between madness and malevolence in a way that still horrifies criminal psychologists to this day. Albert Fish was not just a killer, he was a doctrine of cruelty made flesh. Number 1, H.H. Holmes, America's first serial killer. He built a hotel designed for murder, with trap doors, gas chambers, and cremation furnaces hidden behind the walls. Herman Webster Mudgett, better known as H.H. Holmes, turned architecture into an instrument of death. Known as America's first documented serial killer, Holmes created an entire ecosystem in which people could vanish without a trace. Born in 1861 in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, Holmes was unusually intelligent from a young age. He had a fascination with anatomy and reportedly performed surgeries on animals as a child. He graduated from medical school in Michigan, where he was already engaged in insurance scams and grave robbing, using cadavers to collect life insurance payouts under false identities. But it was in Chicago during the 1893 World's Fair that Holmes fully realized his deadly ambitions. There he constructed a 3-story building later dubbed the Murder Castle. It was a hotel on the outside, but a labyrinth of horrors within. The rooms were windowless and soundproofed. Some were rigged with gas lines for asphyxiation. Others contained hidden chutes that led to the basement, where homes had surgical tables, vats of acid, and incinerators. The layout was intentionally disorienting, with stairways that led to nowhere, doors that opened to brick walls, and peepholes from which Holmes could watch his guests die. Holmes hired and fired contractors frequently during construction, so no one but him understood the full layout. He told some he was building a hotel, others that it was a boarding house or retail space. In reality, it was a slaughterhouse. He targeted young women, often those new to the city for work or visiting the fair alone. Many were lured with job offers, marriage proposals, or the promise of lodging. Once inside the castle, they were often never seen again. Holmes used his medical knowledge to dispose of bodies efficiently, sometimes selling skeletons to medical schools, other times reducing them to ash or dissolving them in chemicals. His crimes went unnoticed for years due to the transient nature of his victims and the chaos of the booming city. But eventually, suspicions arose when Holmes was caught in a fraudulent insurance scheme involving the murder of a business partner. Once arrested, investigators began unearthing the full scale of his operation. Holmes confessed to 27 murders, though only 9 were confirmed. However, many historians estimate the real number could be as high as 200. In his confession, he stated that he was born with the devil inside him. He described his own lack of empathy with eerie detachment and even claimed to enjoy the act of killing more than profiting from it. He was convicted in 1895 and hanged the following year. It is said that during his execution, his neck did not break immediately, and he died slowly over several minutes, an irony given the long, calculated deaths of his victims. Why is H.H. Holmes ranked number 1? Because he industrialized murder. He created a system in which death was not a side effect. It was the design. The murder castle was more than a building. It was a psychological extension of Holmes himself, manipulative, deceptive, and utterly void of conscience. He didn't kill in rage. He killed with the cold efficiency of a businessman. Holmes represents the transition from personal violence to systemic predation. He was charming, educated, and well-dressed. People trusted him, and he used that trust to disappear them. He didn't just murder. He built a machine to make it easy.